Good evening to you both, and let's begin with the cross-border dialogue over Alberta's pitch for a new pipeline. BC Premier David Eby has dismissed the idea, citing lack of a project to consider. Alberta's Premier, however, remains undeterred and is confident concerns can be overcome.
I'm saying that I'm going to convince David Eby of it because I know that this is good for the country. I know that he's on Team Canada, and I can't imagine in the end that if we meet the issues that have been raised by British Columbia, that he would go off Team Canada.
Smith told CTV's Question Period the pipeline would be part of a federal push for nation-building infrastructure. While the federal government has made it clear no province can be forced to take on a project it does not support. Okay, Donna, the BC government has said it needs to see actual projects, viable economic projects. So what kind of position does that put Alberta in when it comes to making a case, an economic case? And should that be Alberta's responsibility?
It's a chicken and egg problem, and it's been going on forever. No proponent is going to come forward and pitch a pipeline when there is not consensus across the provinces to build one. It just doesn't work. We've seen this not work for many, many years. We have experience with this. So I think it's quite wise of the Alberta Premier to turn the table on Eby and say, look, I want to be part of Team Canada. Province of Alberta wants to be part of Team Canada. We've been talking about trade corridors. Everybody's talking about them. I think the risk is that we may end up with a pipeline going east into Hudson's Bay with the support of the rest of the prairies before we see a pipeline going to BC. And that is totally illogical because the closest markets are in the West. I don't think that a practical man like Prime Minister Carney is going to ultimately let that happen. And I think she's banking on that.
Okay, so Graham, is this strictly about consensus building, or at some point, could it boil down to one province vetoing another province's objections?
Yeah, well, look at the history. You know, we had the Trans Mountain Pipeline. You had BC. When you had an NDP government in BC, NDP government in Alberta, they didn't get along over the pipeline. And you had, the wine war between Alberta and BC. So when you get the Premier here saying, Alberta's a sovereign, province within the United Canada, well, BC can say, hey, listen, we're sovereign too. You could have a transnational, some sort of big super project, nation-building project. It doesn't have to be a pipeline. Alberta's all about it has to be a pipeline. And BC is saying, no, we don't think so. So this is a problem as well. No one's actually defined what the nation-building project is. Alberta is saying, yes, it must be a pipeline. BC has said, no, it could be something else. They're more, looking at things like improving the railway transportation system in Canada. But we're all focused now on another pipeline. And you go back to Northern Gateway, in a sense, Alberta wants to reopen Northern Gateway. And you blame Ottawa for shutting that down. It was the Federal Court of Appeal was when it tore up that approval for Northern Gateway, saying the Harper government hadn't done enough when it came to a consultation with First Nations and also looking at the environment. And speaking of First Nations, you've got them, the Assembly of First Nations, saying, wait a minute, unless you consult with us deeply and respectfully, you won't get anything done. It's another issue. So it's not the case of Alberta saying we want this done and bring in the Prime Minister and force that on BC. You got many other things going on in terms of consultation that could make this a very difficult project to get done. And once again, no one's defined what a nation-building project is yet. Alberta wants a pipeline. That doesn't mean the rest of the country is going to agree to that.
Well, Donna, what's the likelihood it will take incentives to unlock BC pipeline opposition? And will that fall to the federal government, to bring it back to your point about Mark Carney?
I think Mark Carney has played his hand here. He knows he needs to put a pipeline on that list. If there is no pipeline on the list of 10 nation-building projects, I think there will be hell to pay in Alberta. They expect a pipeline, and I think there's legitimacy to this. We've got to pay for these nation-building projects, and we've got to pay for it military. Where's that money going to come from if we don't increase our exports of oil? So I think it's a defensible argument. To Graham's point about the First Nations, I think that's another question. I had a really interesting conversation with some First Nations leaders very recently, and their message to me was, free, prior, and informed consent means that consent has a price tag. I think everything has a price tag here. I think we're naive to think otherwise, whether it's BC's approval or First Nations. Consent has a price tag.
Okay. Well, next up, Alberta lifting the ban on liquor imports from the U.S. Alberta Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis imposed the ban in March over Trump tariffs and the ongoing trade war. Now, the AGLC has announced it will once again accept American products. And in a statement, the Minister of Service Alberta says the province is trying to signal a renewed commitment to open and fair trade, and that the decision sets the stage for more constructive negotiations ahead of a trade agreement renewal, potentially leading to new trade opportunities for Alberta. Graham, if there's continued reluctance to buy American booze, does it matter that Alberta has lifted this ban?
You know, I got to say, I didn't notice the ban. I went into liquor stores and I buy a bottle of wine, and there was American wine was available. You know, in Ontario, they took the American liquor and wine off the shelves. You could see it very definitely. No more U.S. Alcohol, wine, whatever, for sale. I didn't notice it in Alberta. It was very much a case of, if you're going to buy Canadian, you could buy Canadian. And a lot of wine stores, not that I went to a lot of wine stores, but I understand they had like a made in Canada label. You could tell right away which wine came from Canada as opposed to the U.S. So I think it's really up to, I think, consumers, you know, supply and demand. If Albertans don't want to buy American wine, then you don't buy American wine. That will get the message across to the Americans, as opposed to a ban that I got to say, I didn't notice. Anecdotally, I didn't see it.
Okay, well, Donna, the Premier led an Alberta government delegation to Washington, D.C. last week. The announcement on lifting the ban came at the end of the week. So how much of a role do you see discussions with U.S. politicians playing in the decision here?
Oh, I think it was significant. And I think, as Graham's pointed out, it's a bit of an irony. I think we are choosing, I much prefer Canadian beer to American beer. And I don't think I'm alone in that. But I think the Americans are really looking to that signal. For them, this is a very big deal, the fact that we've got a ban on their alcohol. And the other big deal I'm hearing is procurement, the fact that we've said no Americans can be involved in some procurement things that are happening within provinces. Ontario's got that policy in place, really irritates them. So I think it was the Premier of Alberta kind of scratching that itch. This is bothering us a lot, and her response was to do something about it, to respond to the Americans.
And Graham, how much of a sign is this that maybe a Canada-U.S. trade deal is imminent, maybe even by the time of the rapidly approaching G7 summit in Kananaskis?
Yeah, it's one of the pieces of speculation that the UCP, you know, has inside information. We're moving towards a deal, so Alberta's getting ahead of the parade and saying, yeah, we'll keep on and buying U.S. beer, liquor, whatever. So there's that sense that, yes, we're on the cusp. And we've heard, you know, stories about secret negotiations, not really secret anymore, from the U.S. envoy, ambassador to Canada, saying, look, right now, Canada, behind the scenes, federal government's talking to the U.S. administration behind the scenes to work on a deal. So even though publicly we're not seeing that, but it seems these secret negotiations aren't so secret. So yes, so maybe this is a precursor to something coming that's going to actually help resolve, you know, this trade war with the U.S., even though Trump just increased tariffs on our steel and aluminum, but maybe things are going to get better.
Days ahead of the leaders arriving at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, the federal government has announced a significant boost in defense spending.
Canada will achieve NATO's 2% of GDP target this year, half a decade ahead of schedule.
The Prime Minister committing to rebuild, rearm, and reinvest in the Canadian military, adding more than $9 billion in spending to the fiscal framework this year. That's on top of the existing $45 billion budget. Donna, purely about timing, with the world leaders arriving in Alberta in less than a week's time for the G7, what do you make of the message the Prime Minister is sending here?
Well, absolutely. He's got them coming for the G7, and that's important. And it ties into the security conversations he's been having with the Trump administration. It also is in advance of the NATO meetings, which are later in June. And the pressure is going to be not just to get to 2%, but they're talking about 3.5%. And some countries are even talking about 5% of GDP. So He's really got to get ahead of it. The big challenge, though, is in Canada. He's got to convince Canadians that we can pay for it, and I think that still is work to be done.
Graham, in terms of the politics involved, how far do you see this going to repairing Canada's reputation where NATO partners are concerned? Will this make Canada a player again on the international stage?
Well, you would hope so. And Donna makes a really good point about, Canadians, will they buy into this? Because Canada has a history of, during wartime, we're there. But then when things quieten down, all of a sudden we let the military kind of just rot away, if I can use that term, kind of get rusty at the very least. And then look at Afghanistan. We get involved in Afghanistan. That's NATO mission. And then we put money in as a bit of a panic. And we'll then end up, sort of trying to catch up to things. And when you got Donald Trump say, put more into NATO, I got to say that, and the one thing I agree with Donald Trump, and he's right, we've got to spend more because we have a partnership in NATO. And especially now, speaking of Donald Trump, he's getting kind of cozy with the Russians. NATO is all about, pushing back against the former Soviet Union and now Russia. And I got to say, anecdotally, I saw this firsthand. I'm a reporter. I was a journalist in Afghanistan in 2007, 2008. And back then, we didn't have helicopters. We had to rely on our NATO allies for helicopters. And what made it really ironic, I got to say, in 2008, I visited the Netherlands base or the troops there, and they were using our old helicopters. We were cutting back in the 1990s, sold our helicopters to other countries, and then we saw them being used by other countries in Afghanistan when we had no helicopter. Making it more dangerous for us, we were forced to use trucks and armored vehicles, a lot more dangerous. So my point is, we get this yo-yo effect when it comes to spending on the military. And I think it's time we actually became serious about this. We're a member of NATO. Things are really unsettled in the world. We have to spend more, at the very least 2%. As Donna pointed out, it could be 3.5 or even 5 in some countries. We have to spend more. And I think this is going to be a signal not just to Trump, but also to the rest of the world and also to our NATO allies.
Donna, to your point about Canadians buying in, how worried should Canadians be about where the money will come from to facilitate this boost in defense spending? And should it require the tabling of a budget sooner than later?
I think it's a legitimate concern. The Auditor General has already spoken up about our fighter jet budget being, totally out of whack. We are going to have to spend far more than we anticipate, and we don't have pilots prepared to get in the jump seat. So that's a problem. We have the estimates, and there is a process for questioning and talking about budgetary items. But what the public in Canada is hearing is, your taxes are going to go down, and yet this investment is really a significant investment, which I believe most Canadians would actually support. Anybody I've talked to in the military, it's embarrassing. It's unconscionable, frankly. So I think the will is there, and certainly the external drivers will be there, but we do need to know where the money's going to come from. Will that create pressure for an actual budget this summer? I'm not absolutely convinced, but I think there will have to be a lot more disclosure about where that money is going to come from, even if it's in big terms. And right now, there's nothing at all. It's just we're going to spend more.
And Donna, does that in turn bring back that conversation about pipelines?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the grand bargains are being struck as we speak. We have to pay for all these things. And the only way we pay for big investments like this is to be able to increase our productivity. And that, for a country like ours, means increasing our exports. So, Carney has talked about, we can make contributions to critical minerals and AI, and that's part of the budgeting process to get us to our 2% or maybe even more. It's part of NATO. But we've got some really big items coming up here, including nation-building projects that have to be paid for in the military. We've got to pay for them somehow, and I don't see everybody being in love with the idea of more debt, especially if we haven't got those projects in place.
And Graham, surprise Monday's announcement did not include any reference to Donald Trump's Golden Dome missile defense proposal.
Well, no, I'm not surprised at all. That to me is ridiculous. One general called it a protection racket that Trump is trying to foist on his country and also in Canada, and once again change the dialogue into some other issue beyond what's actually happening today. I agree with Donna, and the budget's going to be a major issue. But when it comes to a pipeline, it's not as if they can say, we'll get the pipeline built tomorrow. And I'm not trying to be pejorative here, Donna. I'm just saying this could take 5, 6 years, even if they fast track a pipeline. But the thing is, the pipeline will make sense if the demand for oil keeps increasing. But what happens in 5 years? You get a pipeline built, different administration in the U.S. begins to take climate change seriously again, and the world's moving away from oil. So that's going to be an issue down the road. But I do agree with Donna 100% when it comes to, it's nice to say, so let's spend money here and spend money here, military, whatever, big projects. But the problem is, how do you actually pay for these things? This is what I want to see the government actually explain. It's something we're all waiting to hear an answer.
Indeed. Okay, we have to leave it there. We're out of time. Good to see you both. Thank you kindly for this.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, time for us to take a bit of a break. But when we come back, the federal government's move to meet NATO's 2% of GDP funding target. More from our politics panel in a moment.